Fellas, I'm going to be creating the biggest same country fights in the UFC. So two fighters in the same weight class from the same country matched up against each other, and I'm going to be trying to pick the biggest possible fight you can make between two fighters from the same country. Some of the fighters on some of the countries, it's really difficult to do because a lot of them just aren't in the same weight class, or there's just not many fighters from that particular country. Some of them were definitely easier to think of, so I've tried thinking of one kind of big fight from the same country between two fighters from the same country. So let me know if I missed any popular countries out, or if I missed any obvious picks out. So I've started off with Brazil, and I've gone with Alex Pereira versus Johnny Walker. Yeah, this will be, as a fight, I think it'll be, quite promotable. You've got two strikers on one end, and I feel like they're really contrasting. You've got Alex Pereira, who's essentially, he's an S-tier striker, but he's really calm, calculated, and technical. And then you've got Johnny Walker, who's one of the wildest fighters in the UFC, definitely one of the wildest in the light heavyweight division, at least. And then you look at the personalities. You've got Johnny Walker, who, again, his fight style kind of represents his personality as well, because he's got this crazy personality. And then you've got Pereira, who's just quiet and calm. So I feel like their styles would go against each other really well, even though Johnny Walker's most likely to get chinned. The build-up to the fight as well. Again, if this was a Brazilian headline, it easily sells out. You've got Johnny Walker, who's quite a promotable light heavyweight fighter. I'm not going to say contender anymore because he has just been chinned by Magomed Ankalaev. And then you've got Pereira, who's first of all the champion of the UFC, one of the biggest, champion of the light heavyweight division, one of the biggest stars in the UFC. It's a promotable fight for a headliner in Brazil. Maybe get Pantoja on the co-main event. And the reason I've not included Pantoja on this in Brazil is because, he's just not really a star, is he? You can also go Charles Oliveira, but again, you've got the problem that there's no one else in the lightweight weight class that's a Brazilian that could be competitive against Charles Oliveira. So I've had to go with Ankalaev and Walker. I think it'd be a fun build-up, easy main event in Brazil. Obviously, it doesn't really make sense because he's just lost to Ankalaev as Walker, but if this fight was to happen, I think it'll be, it would have happened if Walker was to beat Magomed Ankalaev. So Ankalaev versus Pereira, I think it's a decent fight between two Brazilian fighters, and who knows, maybe we will see it one day, I don't know. Next country, United States of America. Now this one, America's not really that difficult to think of stars because a large majority of the UFC roster are obviously American, so it's not really hard to pick out these big stars. And even though there's quite a lot of big stars, it's kind of hard to choose. We've got Sean O'Malley on one end. He can be matched up against people like Henry Cejudo. You've got John Jones against maybe a Stipe or Curtis Blades. But I've gone with Nate Diaz versus Dustin Poirier. Yeah, this fight is so promotable. First of all, they've got bad blood between each other. They've been talking a lot on Twitter about how they want to fight each other and how they'd beat each other. So they've been talking for a really long time. I'm kind of surprised they haven't had a fight yet because of how much they've been, going at each other. The fight itself will be entertaining as well. You've got Nate Diaz, who's got that dog in him, just goes to the end, slugs it out till the end, and doesn't quit. And then you've got Dustin Poirier, he's one of the best boxers in the lightweight division. Again, comes to scrap, never in a boring fight. This fight would not be boring. It's impossible for this fight to end up boring. This ain't no Nate Diaz versus Tony Ferguson. Even though Dustin Poirier most likely would absolutely batter Nate Diaz. Who knows? Maybe Nate Diaz would come out with something like he did against Leon Edwards. But as a fight itself, it'll be entertaining. And like I said, the build-up, you've got Nate Diaz, one of the biggest stars in the UFC, and I don't really need to explain why, versus Dustin Poirier. I've compared Dustin Poirier to other American contenders like Chandler and Gaethje. He's got more followers than all of them. Obviously, he's got the big fights with McGregor under his belt as well. So I feel like Dustin Poirier versus Nate Diaz. You know what? I'm still surprised we never saw this fight. Like I just said, I wish we saw this fight even on like a UFC 300. I know Poirier's booked against Benoit Saint Denis for $299, but even a fight on the UFC 300 or in the future with Nate Diaz and Dustin Poirier, I just really want to see this fight. And between two American fighters, I feel like this is the biggest fight you can make right now. Nate Diaz, Dustin Poirier, maybe, definitely a pay-per-view main event for a non-title fight because, they've done that before with obviously Masvidal and Covington. So Diaz versus Poirier, main event in between two American fighters, obviously in America. I feel like that would bang. Next country, we've got Russia. Now, obviously, if we're talking about Russia, you've got to include Islam Makhachev. He's one of the biggest fighters in the UFC when it comes to popularity. He's one of the most exciting fighters in the UFC. He would be promotable against anyone. And then I've picked Arman Tsarukyan. Now, I'm pretty sure Arman Tsarukyan represents two countries, Russia being one of them. Now, the weird thing about this fight is it's actually happened before. Obviously, before Islam was champion, he faced Arman Tsarukyan and won. But it could also happen again. Arman Tsarukyan's coming off a dominant win of Beneil Dariush, and he's going to be fighting Charles Oliveira, who's previously lost to Islam. So if Arman Tsarukyan beats Charles Oliveira, it's going to be hard to say that Arman Tsarukyan doesn't deserve a title shot. Obviously, we've got Gaethje as well, but Islam versus Arman Tsarukyan, it's a promotable fight. Maybe on the mic, it wouldn't be the best fight, but again, it's one of those fights where their skills sell the fight. I mean, there's not really much Russians in the UFC that are amazing on the mic anyway, so it's not like we're expecting big things, but their styles sell it. I mean, you look at both of these guys fighting, it's really hard to find a boring fight between you. You've got Islam Makhachev, who's finished Charles Oliveira, finished Volkanovski, had an absolute banger of a fight with Volkanovski as well, other finishes over Dan Hooker and Bobby Green, and then you've got Arman Tsarukyan, who's kind of just running through the lightweight division, obviously with his most recent win over Beneil Dariush. It's a promotable fight just because of the skills itself, and this although I would say in Russia, but that's obviously not going to happen, so it's most likely going to happen in Abu Dhabi, which would be a bit of a letdown because I'm not the massive fan of the Abu Dhabi venue, but it's a competitive fight, one of Islam's biggest challenges in the lightweight division, and I feel like between two Russian fighters, Islam versus Arman Tsarukyan, one of the best you can make right now, so that's my pick for Russia. Next country, we've got England. Now, obviously, MVP signed to the UFC against Kevin Holland at 299, so he's now part of the roster. And yeah, I mean, there's not really much English fighters in the same weight class. The only one I can think of is at featherweight, where we've got, what's his name, Arnold Allen, Nathaniel Wood, and Lerone Murphy in the same weight class, and none of them are stars. So I've gone Leon Edwards and Michael Page. Yeah, obviously, Leon Edwards, the defending welterweight champion. No one wants to see him against Bilal Muhammad. I think him versus MVP, again, they don't need to talk trash on the mic. Their styles sell it. You've got Leon Edwards, this kind of similar to Pereira, a really, really technical kind of point fighty style. I know that's not Pereira, but a point fighty technical style. And then you've got MVP, who's just all guns blazing, one of the most entertaining fighters outside of the UFC. And now he's joining the UFC. If MVP can somehow get past Kevin Holland and maybe, get a couple of welterweights on his resume, if we ever see a Leon Edwards versus Michael Venom Page, that's one of the biggest fights you can make in the UK, because UK MMA isn't massive, but if you're going to put it against two well-known stars, one guy who everyone knows and is familiar with Leon Edwards, and then MVP, again, the human highlight reel from the UK, if you put that in like a UK venue, maybe like the O2 Arena, that would sell. So Leon Edwards versus Michael Venom Page, and the thing is, well, at least Michael Page, he's expressed interest in this fight. He's said in multiple interviews on multiple occasions that he wants to fight Leon Edwards in the UK, and to be honest, I completely think that's a good shot. Obviously not right now because there's too many contenders for Leon to go through, but UK pay-per-view main event, MVP versus Leon Edwards. If MVP gets a few wins under his resume, who says no? Because this would be a banger of a fight, and I really do hope we see this fight one day. Striker versus striker, promotable styles. Yeah, I really want to see this fight. Next country, China. Now, this is the only one on the list where it's actually two female fighters. Now, for China, Zhang Weili versus Yang Xiaonan. Now, this isn't some super fight like the rest of them. It's no pay-per-view main event. I mean, it's already been booked for UFC 300, and a lot of people found disappointment from it. Personally, you know what? If we're going to have a female fighter on UFC 300, I don't mind it being Zhang Weili, because she puts on bangers every time. Her versus Yang Xiaonan, I'm not sure why they didn't do like a main event in China with maybe Song Yudong as the co-main event for a fight night, obviously that is. But yeah, Yang Xiaonan versus Zhang Weili, that is probably the biggest Chinese fight you can make right now. The Chinese fans must be loving this, because the winner of this fight, regardless, they're representing China, so I'm not sure. They're most likely going to be rooting for Zhang Weili. But yeah, a banger of a fight. Again, it's going to be Zhang Weili putting an absolute dominant performance over Yang Xiaonan. Two Chinese fighters, again, would have made more sense to do it in like a fight night in China, but for a female MMA fight, I feel like people were overhating this fight. Listen, on paper, maybe it's not that promotable. Neither of them are absolutely massive names in the UFC, but when it comes to female MMA, I'd much rather watch a Zhang Weili versus Yang Xiaonan than Pennington versus Silva again. So I'm not going to say I'm disappointed with the fight, but I'd say I'm happy with the fight. I'm glad that this is the female fight that got added, the female title fight. So this in China, biggest Chinese fight you can make right now in the UFC, in my opinion, between a champion and a contender that are both Chinese. So that's my pick for China. And then the next fight. Listen, before you all start commenting saying, they're not from the same place in Africa and Africa's a continent, listen, I know. I'm just going to be included all of the, the significant African countries in one, because I'm not going to be going through every single individual country in Africa. So let's just assume, well, we've got Dricus du Plessis from South Africa and Israel Adesanya, who's, well, basically from wherever he wants to be, depending on the day of the week, because he said he's from pretty much every country now. But between two African fighters, Dricus du Plessis versus Adesanya, again, another one of those fights that has been close to happening. This is one of the biggest rivalries in the UFC that hasn't been settled. They had the massive face-off at UFC 290. Since then, Adesanya lost to Strickland. Dricus du Plessis beat Strickland, so it's not looking great, even though I do think they're probably going to try and push this fight. If it's not Strickland, it's got to be Adesanya. Maybe Cannonier, but I mean, if pay-per-view-wise, Adesanya is much more of a smarter choice. And it's one of the few fights that, you know, maybe it would excite Adesanya. I feel like when Adesanya's fighting at middleweight, I know he's obviously come off the big rivalry against Pereira and Strickland, but I need a fight that's going to, you know, excite the fans when it's against Adesanya. And I feel like Dricus is the perfect one to do that, because at least this time, instead of Adesanya being the one defending, it's Dricus being the one defending against Adesanya. And I want to see that for a change, because Adesanya, if there's one thing I can, you know, you can give props to Adesanya, it's whenever Adesanya is fighting for the belt, not defending the belt, but fighting for the belt, when he's the challenger, he's always putting on banger fights. The history has repeated itself. Whenever Adesanya's fighting for the belt, it's always been a great fight. So, Dricus versus Adesanya in South Africa or anywhere in Africa, I still think they should have done this fight. Well, obviously, assuming Adesanya hadn't lost to Strickland, but hopefully we do see this one day. Maybe if, I don't know, Strickland loses and there's no one else, so we have to bring in Adesanya again. I hope we see this fight one day. It's kind of one of those rivalries that we need to see settled. So, and that, in my opinion, is the biggest same country fights in the UFC. Like I said at the beginning, let me know if I missed any, you know, major countries out, or I missed any fights out, or there were some obvious picks that I didn't pick. So yeah, let me know your thoughts on it. Let me know your thoughts on the video, and thank you for watching.